episode 102 of Sports Shorts. My guest today is fellow SLA board member and the CEO of the United States of America Anti-Doping Agency, Travis Tigert. Travis, welcome.
Hey, Bobby, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invitation.
Uh,
Thrilled to do it.
well, really happy to have you here. And let's start off like we always do with our program. Why don't you tell everybody what your job's about? What does the CEO of USADA do? And if you could also fill us in on what was the path that you took professionally to end up here?
Yeah, well, thanks for that. It's an honor to represent athletes. I think Mike Lupico, which many sports fans know the name, great, ESPN, New York Daily News. He once described us as the union for clean athletes, and we certainly view ourselves in that regard. So, my job is to stand in the shoes of athletes and make sure that they're right to participate on a drug-free, fair, level playing field is upheld, and that the sacrifice that they make on a daily basis, forgoing opportunities for college or, giving up a life, a career to represent their country at the highest levels of international Olympic and Paralympic competition, that sacrifice is rewarded and upheld, and that they have a chance to win on a daily basis. We have our program really, four different areas. One obviously is testing, education, preventative efforts. So we want to give athletes the information and allow them to be successful in what can be an intrusive and sometimes what might seem a arcane anti-doping environment. We do research and science. And then, how I got into it initially as the general counsel, and before that as outside counsel back in 2000, where I was at a private law firm, and we just got hired to do the legal work for this new entity. We're actually in our 25th year as an entity in the Olympic and Paralympic movement to protect the rights of athletes. So it's our 25th year anniversary in October, is the results management. So we have investigators, we have a dispute resolution process. So anytime an athlete or a coach, other person, commits a violation, they have a full legal process that they go through. It's before arbitrators in the new era arbitration, a pool of arbitrators that are selected by us and the athletes in the Olympic movement, the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. And then they have an appeal right to what's known as the Court of Arbitration for Sport. So there's a lot of law, a lot of science, a lot of education involved in what we do. And, my role is to really just make sure the organization is, fit for purpose, that we're trying to do better each and every day, to deliver on the promise that we make to athletes to be the best for them so that their sacrifice ultimately is rewarded.
It's interesting you pointed out that USADA's only been around 25 years. And I think back to watching those East German women swimmers in the 70s and ask myself, what took so long? What took so long to investigate and to stop turning a blind eye to doping in sports? What's your sense of what was the moment that really brought USADA about?
Yeah, it's a great question, and look, it's why we fight so hard today on topics like the Chinese 23 swimmers whose the rules weren't applied to in the way that they should have been applied to, is because we've heard from swimmers, Shirley Bavashoff and others who competed against the East Germans, and that losing the opportunity to win at the highest levels because someone defrauds you and the public, it haunts those athletes for their entire lives. And our founding chair was Frank Shorter, who you may know. Some know him because he actually was great marathoner. Steve Prefontaine, actually, the night that he was in a car accident, had just dropped Frank Shorter off at Frank's house. But Frank went on to win the 72 Olympic marathon, gold medalist. He's actually the last male to win a medal in the gold medal in the marathon at the Olympics. He ended up being second in 1976, and it turned out later he lost to an East German who was on the East German doping program. He was our founding chairperson, and we can't let that happen to this generation of athletes. So what changed it? I think in part the 1988 Ben Johnson, where the 100-meter sprinter tested positive for a very powerful steroid. I think you then saw in the early 90s and mid 90s the influx of money into the Olympic movement like never before, and pharmaceutical companies around the world producing drugs that would materially impact the game like never before. EPO as just one example, human growth hormone as another. Of course, steroids were around long before that, but I think it was that sort of climate that ultimately opened the eyes of the IOC to say, look, we've got to do something. And then, of course, many people are familiar with the 98, 99 Festina affair in the Tour de France, where carloads rather of human growth hormone were found in some of the top professional cycling teams crossing into France. Where, by the way, in France, both in that time and during the Armstrong days, was a crime that you could actually be prosecuted if you, and they saw it as fraud. If you defraud sport, the Tour de France, let's say, you could actually be charged with a criminal offense in France and in other countries still today for doing that. And I think it shows how valuable as a society we find sport, and how we don't like, winners who cheat to win or defraud their competitors to win. It undercuts the very inherent value of what sport is supposed to be about. And so I think it was those moments, Bobby, where a new IOC president came into effect, Jacques Rogue, and he said, we've got to do something. And they established WADA in 1999. Jacques Rogue came in, I think, in 2003. But under that leadership, they said, we're gonna really try to turn the tide, assuming these drugs have infiltrated the sport, because there is no system to regulate it that's very effective. And we're going to try to give back the playing fields to clean athletes so that their sacrifice ultimately, as I mentioned, is rewarded. And certainly when we came into existence in October of 2000, after the Sydney Olympic Games, we said, we're here to do the job. We're not sport promoters. We have great relations with sport, but we're here to ensure that athletes' rights are ultimately upheld and that their sacrifice is rewarded.
Well, it's really interesting because you look at the growth of certain things in sports, and for me, it's always been fascinating, having been caught up in what was a violation of the Ted Stevens Amateur Athletic Act by using the word Olympic in an ad that we were running at Fox Sports.
Oh, is that right?
And our friend Jeff Benz.
You probably still have that cease and desist letter hanging on the wall
we got one of those.
right?
But that's a really interesting question. That in the act it talks about amateurism and blah 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 blah. But we're in a world now where we're trying to determine what amateurism really is.
Yeah.
Because you have so many of the Olympic athletes now are sponsored, which is, I guess they're still an amateur if you're sponsored, and that's different.
Yeah.
So
we don't ever use the word amateur. And in fact, there was a commission, published a report a year or so ago, and one of their recommendations was just remove that nomenclature from the vocabulary, because our Olympic athletes, for years have been able to have some NIL rights. There is no Players Association. There is the Team USA Athletes Commission, which is as close to a Players Association as there is. And frankly, we would love. And we think the pro sports actually have a big advantage in a lot of respects, particularly when it comes to anti-doping policy, because it gives athletes 50% of the say in what those policies are going to look like and buy-in to those policies. And we think globally, especially, athletes ought to have much more say in the rules that apply to them when they play on a daily basis. So there's certainly some downsides not having that, collectively bargained opportunity in the Olympic movement. But at the end of the day, we try to give, our athletes as much of a voice. And we have, I've mentioned Frank Shorter. We've had, a legacy of Olympians as our chair, but also on our board. We currently have Judy Brown Clark, who was the silver medalist in the 84 games and the 400-meter hurdles, who's our chair, and Edwin Moses, who's chair emeritus of our board, to really make sure that our organization is, as I described it at the very beginning, a union for clean athletes, to make sure that clean athletes' rights are respected and upheld at every turn, because it's just too important for their lives and their livelihood, whether they're making a ton of money like professional athletes, or if they're just making enough money to survive, representing their country at the highest levels of international competition.
So clearly, USADA has, I would call it a relationship with the USOPC. Are there other organizations, any professional organizations that utilize your services for keeping sport clean?
Yeah, so we are designated by Congress as we're not a government entity. We're a delegated authority, but and a 501c3 based here in Colorado, where our principal place of business is as well. We have a contract, but basically a 7-year contract, renewable with the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee. They provide us about a third of our funding. The other 2/3, comes from some global services we provide to other organizations that test here in the United States on our Olympic side and other sports. The Professional Fighters League, you may be familiar with.
Mm-hmm.
We run their year-round program. And then, 2/3 of our budget for our Olympic program, roughly 2/3 of our Olympic and Paralympic program, comes from the federal government. And what's really key in our founding and why I think we have been able to one, gain the trust of athletes is because we prove day in and day out that we have the backs of clean athletes. We're here for them. We're not sport promoters. And what's critical in that is for us to be independent of sport promotion. And yes, while we have, a multi-year stable contract with the United States Olympic and Paralympic Committee, importantly, out of our 10-person board of directors, none of them, we have a very strict conflict of interest policy. None of them can simultaneously serve on any sport organization that we provide services to. So you won't find, just imagine, and the quick example I frequently will give, people are familiar with the Lance Armstrong case. Imagine if the head of USA Cycling was on our board, 10-person board, when we had to bring the case against Lance Armstrong that ultimately disqualified 7 Tours de France and upended a number of national records and other prizes that USA Cycling benefited from. That would be an impossible decision for someone at that level. And not that our board members make decisions on individual cases like that. However, you can see the tension between both this promotion, fiduciary responsibility, and sort of the policing fiduciary responsibility. And we think it is impossible. And having sat in the seat here in my office, knowing how difficult it is to bring cases when you have to, when the rules are clearly have been broken against global icons who have done so much for the sport, or anyone else that's done a lot for the sport, or just how tragic it is for the sport when someone decides to cheat it. It would be impossible, we think, to do it in the way that it should be done, that gives athletes the confidence that no one is too big or powerful or famous or lucrative for the sport for the rules not to apply to them. And that's why having that independence, both in perception but also in fact, is so critically important to what we do, Bobby.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I'm thinking now about the classic kid who would raise their hand in class, or in my case, one kid in law school, asking the question, would there be any math in this class? Well, you're in a situation where you're a good old lawyer and you spend a lot of time in the science classroom because it's clear that so much of what you guys do is science-based. And again, one of the insights of what is a sports lawyer, you could be working in science and be a sports lawyer. And it seems that a lot of what you do is evaluating what the right science is for the testing and the variables there. How does that work into your day-to-day life?
Yeah, no, well, particularly when I was the counsel and handling the cases, and trying the cases before the arbitration panels and before the Court of Arbitration for Sport, which I mentioned, and trust me, I 1,000% was the kid who took one chemistry class in high school and barely passed it, and never took another science class, and unless I was forced to. I think I took astronomy at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where I went to undergrad, and maybe stats that qualified for my science classes. I was a philosophy major. So I stayed as far away from it as I possibly could. That said, and it's great question and great, advice for young lawyers. You have to be prepared, and you have to know the industry in which you're working, even if it's something that doesn't necessarily become your first passion in life. And so, what I did is I went out to our laboratories. We have two that we use at the time, UCLA, and I was fortunate to have the mentoring of the laboratory director out who ran the '84 Olympic Analytical Laboratory, Dr. Don Catlin. He's a legend in our anti-doping world. He passed away a year ago or so, but I was very fortunate to have the mentoring of him, and I literally would watch the samples come in, be aliquoted on the chemistry bench, watch the chemistry be done, follow that sample around. And athletes have, in our world and many professional sports as well, have the right to watch the beast sample analysis, and they can send an expert in if they want to. Well, I took advantage. Every time an athlete would have an expert go, I would tell my boss at the time, I need to also be there. And Don Catlin, of course, loved it because he was simultaneously helping, prepare and make it more efficient when it came time to try the case, that I was there watching each and every step of the process. So you just have to dive in and learn it. Thankfully, we've got some of the top scientists that work on our team. Dr. Matt Fedorik's our chief science officer, Dr. Laura Lewis, and they are jack of all trades, but stay on top of the analytical data that is necessary to ensure that we're doing the job we should be doing, that no athlete is wrongly convicted. I mean, a false positive can't happen, and it's never happened in our world. Now, people test positive in the analytical finding is accurate, and they may say I didn't intentionally do it, and that's a very real and live issue, and that's a different question than was it a false positive. So being very clear on what a false positive is, that can't happen, and it doesn't happen out of our labs, and it certainly doesn't happen after our scientists review the laboratory documents before an athlete is notified of a positive test. That would crush the system.
I'm chuckling because now I'm thinking about, there's no false positives, but there's the I didn't know, or I didn't check, or maybe there's a tennis player who has a good excuse. That's a little different. And I think
100%.
People need to understand that. When you say there's no
100%.
false positives, we're not talking about that. I think most of these cases are, I took this protein powder and this wasn't listed in the ingredients, and you test the ingredients, or I don't know how this got into my system. And then you get into this what seems to be a scientific discussion. Well, there was only this many parts per million
Right.
versus a knowing use. What's the balancing act
Yeah.
that goes on in
Yeah.
those cases?
Well, and for the lawyers out there, the system is a strict liability system, right? So it's just like a speeding
Yeah.
ticket. You can't say, well, I didn't know I was speeding and get out of it. It doesn't matter. So intent is really taken out of the equation for purposes of whether an offense has been committed. Okay. So however you tested positive, whether it was from intentional use or innocent use or innocent exposure, the burden, once that positive comes forward, is shifted to you to prove, one, what is the source, and then number two, that you were without fault or without significant fault. So it's a tort type system.
Mm-hmm.
And then that can reduce ultimately the amount of sanction or suspension length, depending on the substance that you ultimately receive. And you can go down to, if you prove the source was an innocent source, that no matter what you did, you couldn't have avoided it, you can go down to a no fault and demonstrate, hey, this was the source of the positive, and I was without any fault. And if that happens, you can get a public announcement. You'll be disqualified if the positive came from an event, because the assumption is you got some benefit, and that's only fair to the other athlete. So that's good policy, we think. But you can actually have a no fault finding. They're very rare because the proof is really difficult, because we now know that there are what I will call innocent sources causing positive tests. and it's a function of our laboratory's ability to see really, really, really low levels. Some scientists have told me that the lab's ability, WADA accredited labs around the world, their ability to see small, minute traces of drugs has gone down. So they can see 1,000 times smaller amounts just in the last 10 years. And so what that does is raises the question of, all right, are these contaminants in our water? Are they, transferred from one person to another unintentionally? And in the tennis case, the Yannick Sinner case, it's gotten a lot of attention recently for a lot of reasons. We know, and that's a published case. It wasn't our case, but we've read the decision and we've spent a lot of time looking at the facts of it. So we know the case. But Closterball, he had a very low level positive test for Closterball. It's a steroid. It's one of so in the category of harder core drugs. Well, we know both from peer-reviewed, published scientific papers, as well as other cases where athletes have tested positive for Closterball. In Italy, in a drugstore, over the counter, you can buy like a lip cream medicine, a lotion for like eczema or small cuts on your hands that actually has Closterball in it. So there was an experiment done where they took one of those creams and they rubbed it on their hands. It dried. A couple hours later, that person went and shook hands with another person. They then took the urine of the person that didn't use the Closterball, but who shook hands with the person that did. And that person had really, really, really low levels of Closterball positive.
Wow.
It's incredible. And I understand why athletes think, how ridiculous of an excuse is it that Sinner said his masseuse used this cream and then later, after it dried, gave him a massage, and that when he then was tested, that's what showed up. But we know that it can happen, as ridiculous as that sounds. And so this is where the strict liability system is really, really difficult, because that's one example. But we Bobby, another case, we've had a neoprene arm sleeve that had the sweat from one athlete that was using what's known as Ostarine, who then loaned the sleeve to someone else. And we did the experiment. This is not just trusting what these athletes say, right? Because we know from a Cass case, the common currency of the guilty and the innocent is the denial, right? So what is the evidence, the scientific proof that corroborates the testimony of the athlete? And we've done that particular science experiment as well. And so this is really where we're trying to focus our efforts going forward to get WADA, and we have really since 2018, when we've recognized low-level positives that aren't coming from any recklessness or negligence or intentional use by athletes. They're coming from very innocent, normal everyday behavior that then is shifting the burden to them to have to prove where this came from, or they're looking at potentially a 4 or 2 year sanction.
One of the things you talked about early on in describing the role of USADA in the sport world is one of the pillars you talked about was education. So what is the means by which you educate athletes on staying clean? I mean, how do you, obviously you'd have to be born under a rock to not know that you can't put certain substances in your body and compete. But what is the educational outreach efforts, if any, of USADA with respect to making sure that athletes know what they can and can't do?
Yeah. So the three simple, things to be successful in the program is, it's kind of what you allude to, like don't do drugs, right? It is almost as simple as that. If you need a medication, which athletes are, should be using if they need it, just look at our app. It's called Global Dro. You can see if your medication is allowed or not allowed. If you need it and it's the only one available, then apply for an exemption, a therapeutic use exemption, almost like an independent medical exam is done. If it doesn't increase performance, if it gets you just back to normal health, there's no reasonable alternative, then that can be granted for limited periods of times for an acute or a chronic illness. And then, we have a whereabouts program. So file your whereabouts. When it comes time to things like that innocent source contamination or, positives that I mentioned just a second ago, we warn athletes, if you're traveling to Mexico and China, be careful of the meat that you eat, because we know in those countries the meat is used with clenbuterol in particular, that stays around for a long period of time, and it is demonstrated that there's been low level positives for clenbuterol. Supplements and even vitamins, minerals. Like, we literally, Bobby, you won't believe this either. We've had a prenatal gummy from a reputable vitamin store that tested positive for ostarine at a level, which is a SARMs, a selective androgen receptor modulator, that it basically mimics a steroid. And interestingly, these SARMs and ostarine in particular went through the FDA NDA process. It was rejected because the toxicity of it was so high that the FDA said, we're not going to approve this drug for any sort of legitimate health purposes. And there could have been some, like there is for, steroids, wasting disease, or some of those types of ailments. But anyway, so we can't forget the health aspects of what we do either. But ostarine showing up in a prenatal gummy vitamin, like, oh my gosh. And the problem with nutritional supplements, there's a law, the Dietary Supplement Health Education Act, DSHEA, which has created a 25, $30 billion industry in the United States. The sport performance part of that industry, and the whey proteins and the creatines and all these things that aren't FDA pre-market approved or even reviewed. You just have to register. 90% of the ingredients are coming from either China or India, where there's almost very little quality control. And so what happens is, the same manufacturer over in China that's making the ostarine, which is prohibited, stops making ostarine, but then immediately starts making whey protein. And while whey protein may not be prohibited, it gets some of that ostarine that was in the prior manufacturing, because they're not cleaning the manufacturing process well enough. And then those end up, and it's all demonstrated. So that's the area where we particularly have to be cautious with athletes, because we also know 90% of Olympians surveyed at recent Olympic Games feel the need to use some sort of supplementation. So we really try to convince them, look, food first, and here's how to, get recovery, get bigger, get faster the right way with food. If, because travel, diets, whatever, you feel the need to have supplements and, other dietary products, and maybe there are cases where that is important to do, there's nutritional services, dietitian services from the United States Olympic Paralympic Committee, but there are also products that are certified, and make sure you use one of the recommended certified products out of particular companies, to just try to eliminate any risk that there is. Although very clearly there is always a risk, so just be really smart about it.
So now I'm thinking about the Olympic Village and thousands of athletes there dining at the Olympic Village. I would almost, if I was an athlete and I made it to the Olympics, I might be terrified to eat anything I didn't bring in my own backpack. So is that system being viewed by WADA like at the Olympics? The food that's brought in, where it's sourced, are the athletes protected in that regard?
Yeah, they're. I mean, fortunately, I mean, it's horrifying to think that these types of issues can affect innocent athletes, and it's why we've been so outspoken when this phenomenon has come to our realization. And we've known about the meat, and we've known about some of these low-level innocent positives, and we've been pushing WADA very vocally to change the rules. And we're hopefully finally, while it's been like an aircraft carrier finally moving, turning around and doing the right thing, we're hopeful they're going to get to that point. It continues to put a huge onus on us to make sure we investigate and spend the time on each and every positive test. And look, we're not talking every substance out there that's on the prohibited list. I think we've narrowed it to about 8 substances where if it comes in the door from the lab and it's a low level, our antenna goes up and we say, here are the things we need to do to help this innocent athlete. We literally have a saying here that we say as often as we can. We're going to work just as hard to exonerate the truly innocent as we are to convict those who are intentionally trying to cheat and defraud sport. And that's the justice that we're here to try to serve. And I think it's in part why clean athletes in the U.S. have come to trust us, that we're not here to rack up wins or positive tests. That's an unfair and bad system. We're here to do justice. Now, make no mistake, if you intentionally cheat, and
Oh yeah.
we can say the Armstrong cases, what happened in Russia and China, like we are going to, hold you accountable and ensure that you're removed from the playing field as long as you should be. But that tension in the system, and where the rules haven't yet caught up with the science because of the lab's ability to see so much lower levels now. We're going to continue to stand up and advocate for our athletes. And look, it's created tension with WADA. They don't like. You can look at 5 or 7 press releases that we've done in the last 4 years, let's say, and every one of them calls out WADA for failing to change the rules, to
Well,
being too slow to change the rules.
and there's been some news lately that seems to have resolved between USADA and WADA. Can you fill us in a little bit on what's going on with that? And it seems there's peace again, but there seemed to be a fair amount of tension there for a period of time between your two organizations.
Yeah, well, listen. I mean, first and foremost, our athletes need. Our athletes frequently will tell us, "Look, Josh, we're happy to have to check all our medications and all our supplements and fill out these forms where you can test us anytime. While it's inconvenient, it's intrusive. We understand that's part of being a professional Olympic athlete, and it's way less troublesome than going to the highest levels of our competition, whether in the U.S. or elsewhere, and losing to someone that has cheated us. The problem is when they see other athletes not being held to those same standards, and it's why we've been so vocal. We saw Russia. We now see 23 Chinese athletes in the sport of swimming, 13 of whom went after positive tests that the rules were not applied to. There's no dispute that China did not apply the rules as they should have been applied to those cases. Those athletes went to the 2021, 13 of them, to the Olympic Games in 2021, won several medals. 11 of them competed this past summer in 2024 in the Paris Games. And so we are calling on WADA to be the great equalizer. They're the referee of the world. They're almost like instant replay. In the event that China or the US, that we don't follow the rules and we make the wrong call, their job is to say no. They have an appeal right. They need to enforce the rules. And then they also have the obligation that if a country like China or the US doesn't enforce the rules as they're supposed to enforce the rules, they have mechanisms, the compliance process, to bring action against those countries and those organizations in those countries that aren't following the rules. And they didn't do any of that in these cases. And it's why we've been so outraged, because our athletes are saying, Travis, you're requiring us to do all this stuff and we want to do it, but it can't be we get to the Olympic Games and get beat by athletes who aren't being held to the very same rules that you're holding us to. And so that is what has created, this tension. WADA has said they've done everything right when clearly that's not the case. They refuse to acknowledge or own mistakes that were there. Why it happened, we need answers to that. So what it's done over the last really 9 months or so is, many around the world, athletes, other countries, us, other national anti-doping organizations have attempted to try to get some accountability at WADA. And unfortunately, they've just really pushed back, went the political route. And so, they ended up filing a lawsuit against us. They brought an ethics complaint against the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy. Those have now been dropped, thankfully. By coincidence, it was 3 weeks after we filed our motion to dismiss based on lack of jurisdiction, which we think was very powerful. But that case has now been dismissed. So we're hopeful to move in the right direction. We need WADA to be strong, but we also owe it to our athletes to ensure that they're doing the job that the United States government and other governments around the world are paying them to do. And what we've seen in Russia and now what we see with China is that they're just simply not doing the job that athletes expect them to do.
Well, I guess the answer for them is they can go in and take part in what's being called the enhanced games, which is a whole other subject I don't want to get into, but one of the craziest things I've ever heard. Yeah, take all the steroids you want and compete and set a world record. It's
Yeah, I mean,
madness.
Bobby, from my end, I mean, I don't think that's the solution,
No,
but the status quo is just as unfair, right? And it's forcing athletes to decide, if certain countries are getting a benefit under the rules, Russia, China, that's not fair. That's a charade. So
absolutely.
let's get it in the open. Again, I don't think that's the option, but the current option is not the option either. We have to change the system in order to ensure that it's as fair and robust, so that clean athletes know they have a right to win the right way. And at some point, and look, Michael Phelps and I testified in front of Congress this past summer on these Chinese cases, and nobody wants to throw in the towel and say we just can't win this anti-doping battle. It's too important. We have to fight to win it. But when the global regulator is unwilling to fight to win it, whether it's because a country's too big or they just don't care enough, that's a real problem for athletes who want the system to work to their benefit. And we 100% agree. And it's why we've been so vocal and outspoken to demand answers for the athletes that we answer to.
Well, keep up the good work. Keep up the fight. I think that's what we all want to see is clean athletes in the competition to really find out who has those natural abilities and who's willing to put in the work. And I think that's largely what USADA is supporting. And I don't think there's anybody that objects to it. And as a sports fan and as a huge Olympic fan, I'm appreciative of what you guys have done so that we get to see really who the best athletes in the world are.
Yeah, well,
So
thanks for that, Bobby. It can't be, I firmly believe it goes to the very inherent and the market value, right, of sport. I mean, it's sort of said the enhanced games is not what it should be, but people don't want to watch that. I don't think people want to see real, fair competition. If one team is getting an advantage that they otherwise shouldn't have under the rules, that's a rigged competition. That's not what we're paying. We want the live, unpredictable outcome, and it be based on the rules and the effort and the sacrifice that players make. So I 100% agree with you. I firmly believe the inherent value, the soul of sport, is at stake in this debate, and it's too important especially for lawyers. Once the rules are set, we all should agree that the rules have to be fairly and evenly applied. I mean, it's an equal opportunity argument, frankly,
sure.
and our athletes lose when that's not done. So, as long as the rules are as they are, we're going to keep doing everything we can to ensure that they're fair and applied in a robust way.
Well, thank you for the time today. Thanks for taking the time out of your schedule to speak with us. It's been really interesting, and I think a lot of people are going to be going, "Oh, I guess they're not the bad guys after all." So,
well, thanks, Bobby, for your time. I really appreciate the
well,
opportunity.
well, look, it's been great, and folks, you can go to SLA.org and become a member of the Sports Lawyers Association, which is a great organization. And if you're a member and you haven't renewed your dues, your membership is annual. So if you haven't renewed since December 31st, go to sportslaw.org, renew your membership. And also, registration is now open for our 50th
Wow.
annual conference this year, May 15 to 17 in Nashville. And I hope to see you all there. So you can go to the site, become a member, register for the conference, and come see a review of what 50 years in the sports law world has been like for all of us. And I hope to see you all there. And Travis, if not sooner, I hope to see you at the conference. And thank you again so much for taking the time to talk with us. It's really been a great conversation.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Bobby.
All right, take care.
See ya. Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.